our once we are live. I'm pretty sure we're live now, and so I'm gonna go live on our Instagram as well. And it looks like this time our Facebooks haven't dropped off, so that's fantastic.
Good, yeah, they're working. Excellent.
Absolutely. So, all right, glad to have you on this one. I know the last few we haven't had you, and so it's been tough. I'm hoping some more people, want to come on here live. But like I said, we'll kind of see how things go. And so, all right, we're going to just kind of talk for a second about the ERA, and we'll start talking a little bit about it, and then we really want to focus on the ERA tonight. It doesn't mean we can't answer a few other questions, but people can send in questions about the ERA, questions they have. Keep in mind that if you have that question, someone else has that question. So don't be afraid to ask it, and other people you'll be helping them. So, anyways, I'll put you off here for a second, Ari, and then we'll get back to you soon. So, Dr. Salmon, it's interesting. We were talking about this the other day. Sorry, I have to stay hydrated. And we were talking about the whole ERA thing, and it was interesting how there was a point where it wasn't around. Then it came on. It was like the fad. Everyone liked it. And then a study came out by Doyle et al. And then everybody said, well, you shouldn't do it anymore. And like anything, like any study, you have to break it down and have to look at it. And so I think a lot of people are confused. And I'm sure you've had patients say, well, it's even worth doing. And I've had doctors tell people that, oh, you shouldn't do it because it doesn't benefit, and stuff like that. And so, we thought it'd be a really good topic tonight. For people who are maybe considering doing the ERA, or if someone who's wants to do an ERA, to talk about. And so I'm gonna give I thought I'd give a preview of what got me into the ERA. I think we were talking about this the other night. I was actually talking to another doctor about this the other day, that we know there's what's called a window of implantation. We know this for sure. And the reason we know this is because if you put an embryo back, a day 5 embryo back on day 2 or day 9, it's not going to work as well. So there's a reason why we try to go around day 5, because we know that's normally where the window of implantation is. So the philosophy, obviously, of this makes sense, that of course there's this window, and this test is trying to make it very customized. So it's interesting. I had a lot of patients in the past, and when a transfer didn't work, what we would do is we would just try something different. So, if we had 5 days, we go, let's add 12 more hours onto it. We add 12 more hours of progesterone another day, or we switch over to a natural FVT, which adds extra progesterone. And so people would get pregnant. We're like, oh, good, that protocol works for them.
Yeah.
And so when this ERA came out, it was kind of like, wow, this might explain some of those situations. But like anything, the pendulum swung too far, and people were doing it for everyone. And we actually never did it for everyone, but I even think we were a little bit more liberal with it at the time, and then later we're like, I don't know if it's really for everyone, and here's the people I recommend for. And so that was my experience, the ERA, but I actually have myself anecdotally noticed some difference. I have some great stories I would love to get tonight of some patients I've had, but that doesn't prove that it works. And so I'd love to hear how you got introduced to the ERA, and again, ERA meaning for endometrial receptivity assessment test. There's many companies, iGenomics, there's Cooper Genomics, lots of different ones out there. But love to see your view on this as well, like how you learned about it, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit more about the questions people have, and what the purpose of it is, and does it benefit people.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an interesting topic. I think it's interesting because, like we were talking about the other day, one of the really big gaps in our understanding of fertility is the implantation window. And, we were talking about this, and I feel like our field has come such a long ways in terms of, optimizing fertilization with ICSI, optimizing embryo culture, extended embryo culture, all these amazing things that we've been able to do in the world of like assisted reproduction. But man, we just can't figure out implantation. You know, even the best embryos will fail to implant, you know, anywhere between 30 and 50% of the time, depending on what study you're looking at. So I would say there's a pretty big gap there, because what we know is that there's a lot that we can do to kind of create and select for really great quality embryos, and there's a lot that we still don't know about implantation. And I think it's a really, you know, big reason that so many of us who are REIs were really excited about ERA, because hey, maybe here's a solution to a big problem we've all had, is when you're transferring good embryos and they're not working, you know, why aren't they working? And so when the ERA first came out, I think there was just a tremendous amount of excitement about it. And it's just like so many technologies when they come out, right? You know, whether it's the metaverse or AI or whatever it might be, when it first comes out, you think the sky's the limit. It's gonna be the best thing since, you know, sliced bread. It's gonna solve all our problems. And the reality is probably not quite that. And what happened over time is that, just like you were saying, and just in my own practice, it was starting to be probably overutilized, meaning if some people had failed a transfer, or maybe even people who hadn't failed any transfers, but they only had one embryo or whatever it might be, we're like, well, we should do the ERA. And those were people that would have done maybe equally well or maybe equally poorly with or without the data that we would have gotten back from the ERA. So I think that's one of those things that has been a big thorn in our side, in our field, is kind of how do we deal with this? And I think there are some great studies out there, and no one study answers all the questions. And I think that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what you and I were talking about, is that there's been so many advances in reproductive medicine. I mean, we talked about PGT. I mean, now there's, you know, look at PGTA, PGT, now there's P coming out. You know, there's all these different things. But the one thing we don't know, and the one thing we really are just completely blank on, is what affects implantation. And, you know, we've all had that patient where you, beautiful looking embryo, you put in the uterus, the lighting's perfect, doesn't work. And then you have those other patients where you're like, oh, I don't know if this is going to work. The line's not that great. The best we got to is 6. Might have a vacuole near it. We put it back because, you know, we have to, and they get pregnant. And
Right.
so that next step, that part, that unknown we don't know right now, is implantation. That is really the area that we need to get better at. And so you're right. When it came out, it was like, thank God. And I was talking about an example. I had a patient. It was a really, really interesting patient where they weren't getting pregnant. And it was when we first opened. It was in the first year or two, and we actually had never had anyone not get pregnant, meaning like not even have an HCG with 2 embryos being transferred euploid. It's never happened in our clinic at this point, and we were quite, you know, proud of that. And then we did this transfer, it didn't work. And when I say it didn't work, I meant 0 HCG, and we've never saw that before. And so I thought, God, what's going on here? Is something wrong? And you know, I spoke to someone. They told me about the ERA. I said, you know, let's check this out. We can look at it and we do it. And the patient's off by like 2 days. Like, it's 48 hours, a huge amount. And so, anyways, when we went and did the testing, came back off. We adjusted, and they got pregnant. And so at that point, like, that's not evidence. But I was like, wow, you know, maybe there are these patients that benefit from it. And so, when it first came out, though, do you remember ERAs were kind of a little bit like, I don't think they were really solidified yet as at perfect, meaning that I remember when you had to do 2 biopsies almost all, like, you know, like 10, 20% of the time you had to do a second biopsy. They were really bad at looking at post-receptive. And then even some pre-receptive, they had to have a second biopsy. I remember we were having everyone do 2 biopsies, and then later they kind of refined it. And, you know, they were able to do it in 1 biopsy versus doing 2 biopsies. And I started noticing that it seemed like the results were a little bit more accurate in some ways. Like, I know people do it twice, and it seemed like the results would be a little different. And so I'd love to know, you know, like, in your point of view too, like, I feel like now I don't see that anymore. I don't see as many indeterminates. Right. I don't see as many needing 2 biopsies. love to hear what you think about it. And another thing is, what do you think about? And again, I don't even know your answer to this, so but people know we're having a conversation here. I do
Yeah.
not know his answer. We're just having a conversation. But what do you think about the different companies? I'm not trying to pick on one company or other, but there are some companies that do 12-hour intervals. There are some companies that do 24-hour intervals. And the question is,
Yeah.
does it really make a difference? And what is that window? Like, love to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, it's a great point. Honestly, I like so many things in medicine, there are different companies that will do the same thing more or less, right? They don't do the
Yeah.
exact same things oftentimes. And so this is one of those things where we kind of have to use our best judgment as to what's the better company, which one should we go with? Usually there is no perfect company, but some have pros and cons. If there was a perfect company, the other one wouldn't exist, right? So, I think when we look at that, the ones that kind of give you a little bit of a bigger window or adjust by a smaller amount, it feels like they're hedging their bets a little bit. Now, where all the original research comes from this sort of genetic fingerprint of some 230 genes that are turned on and off in different ways, depending on how much time they've been exposed to progesterone. That seems to activate different on-off switches for this transcriptomic fingerprint. And so the question about the different companies is, well, how well was it validated initially? And I think when you go back to the original validation studies, they're all okay, they're all fair, but none of them are perfect, just because it would be impossible to study it among 1,000 patients, having all the various parameters that you want. Some people who've never failed an embryo transfer, some who have failed 3, etc. So I think when we think about the different companies that are out there right now, personally, I don't have a very strong favorite out there. I think they all do something well. Now here is one thing that I do think is helpful: sticking with the same company as you are going through your management. So if we are using 2 or 3 different companies for the same patient and trying to just get different kind of almost like opinions, I don't think that's very valuable. But what's your take on that? I mean, that's such a interesting thing, because it is something that comes up in our field, different companies doing the same thing.
Yeah. So when I first found out about the companies, I said, well, I need to understand why. So I had the companies send me their data and said, why are you not using, the 12 hours? I thought maybe that's better, right? More information is better. But as you know, sometimes more information can be bad, because now, what happens is that you are making changes that probably aren't needed and stuff like that. Like, there's a point where it makes a difference and it doesn't. And so I looked at it, and again, this is all private data. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of like studies out there that are not biased or haven't been paid for by the company, but it did at least show that it probably doesn't make a big difference, 12 hours. And the matter of fact, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If it was that short of a window, I mean, how would we be batting so well with our our pregnancy rates here, meaning like batting a high average when it's like this window's really, really tiny? And so it kind of made sense that 12 hours maybe is a little too narrow. Now, does that mean it's wrong? No. I mean, if they recommend it, make the small change, I don't think it's gonna make a difference. But that's the question: is, does it make a difference? And so when I was with the previous company, I felt like it constantly said people are pre-receptive and it was only 12 hours. And so I was like, well, did that make a difference? And what was interesting about this was, when we make those adjustments, it didn't seem to always work. Even anecdotally, and I have a pretty good memory of remembering things. So I would like remember, like, okay, last 10 had been happening. And so when we used the other company, or when I look back on our data on the company that was doing 12 hours, the 24-hour people made a big difference. And I found that like the people who were failing were actually, now getting pregnant, and they weren't before. But the 12-hour didn't really make that big of a difference. And again, so anyways, I like I said, the reason we ended up kind of like, it's hard to pick one company, because I think as a clinic, patients come to you and they say, well, when you use this company, I'm not gonna say no, unless there's there's actually valid data out there that shows that it might be hurting their chances, But I think one thing that's going to be interesting for us to talk about is, and I want to make sure everyone understands what an ERA is. In case you're on this, you haven't heard of this. ERA is an endometrial receptivity assessment test, and essentially what it means is naturally when the embryo falls into the uterus, it falls on the 5th day into the uterus. So we mimic that and try to basically put embryos back on that 5th day. So there are some people who deviate from that. Sometimes they have to be now on like day 6 or day 7 or day 4. And so this test, as Dr. Salem mentioned earlier, looks at what's called RNA profiles. And essentially everything in your body uses proteins. And so what happens is that the DNA makes RNA, which is a messenger, to then make a protein. So if you look at different times, instead of looking at what proteins are made, you can say, well, when is the DNA being asked to make this RNA, this message? And then based off of that, that tells you what's going on in the uterus. So sometimes the uterus is like, I'm not going to make this protein right now. I'm not trying to have a baby, at this moment. The baby's not going to land in here. So we can then know using those profiles kind of where things are at. Now, that sounds great in theory, but that doesn't mean it's always, it really works, because there's, as Dr. Sam mentioned, hundreds of these. And there's crossover. It's not like one comes up in this hour and next hour and stuff like that. And so what they did is had to make algorithms. And I think that's part of what allowed them to get a little bit better over time, is they started realizing, okay, this is here, and they tightened those up a little bit. And so now what the study came out, and I'll talk about the one study, the big one that came out in 2000, I think it was 22, was a study that basically showed when empirically giving ERAs, it doesn't have superiority over not doing ERA. And what's important to understand that in a study is that just because something shows, like, is it better, is it worse, or is it the same? And then when you look at that, you have to look at what's called statistical significance. So just because something's better, looks better, if statistically it's just could be chance, you can't say it's because of that. So anyways, that's where this study came from. And I can let Dr. Salem kind of explain then what did this study show, and how did it affect it. The one thing I thought was really interesting, though, Dr. Salem, I didn't know if you knew this before looking this up. So I was actually talking to another doctor last night. I won't name the doctor, to be fair, but we were talking about this again. I was like, oh yeah, we're going to do this topic on it. And he said to me, oh, well, that big randomized, stock trial came out. And I said, no, it wasn't randomized. He goes, yeah, it was a double-blind randomized. So no, it wasn't. It was retrospective. And he's like, it was retrospective? And he didn't even know that. And it's interesting. I wonder how many people don't realize that was not a prospective study. It was a retrospective study. And, obviously that can add some biases and things into it and stuff like that, which we can also talk about here in a minute or two. But anyways, I'm going to let you kind of tell everyone about what that study showed and how that affected us. How did that change it for you? And I'll tell you how it changed for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, the type of study that will give us at least some pause, to think about, hey, here's some data that's kind of going in the other direction. And this is what happens with science. I mean, the goal with any great sort of medical intervention is that you have a series of studies that say, hey, this maybe helps. And then you do, and those would be kind of like retrospective studies. And then maybe you do a prospective study or even a randomized control trial. And you say, hey, this is really looking like it really is helping. And then you have a series of those and you put it all together. And then you have a meta-analysis of randomized control trials. And you say, well, this is awesome. This thing totally seems to work and it's consistent across all these different studies. And obviously that's not exactly what we're seeing with ERA. But to be fair, I think, that study and a recent study that kind of aggregated a lot of data as well, like one of these like meta-analysis, right? They put out together a bunch of data from different studies together. It at least, points out that there is a big question mark that hangs over our head as to if ERA is helpful, who is it helpful for? Because every one of those different studies had a different patient population. Some were women over 38. Some were people who have, women who have previously failed embryo transfers. Some were people who had never had an embryo transfer before. And when you compare so many dissimilar things, you're going to get a little bit of noise in that data. And so all I'm saying there is that I think we're at a little bit of a crossroads where this test scientifically appears to make sense, but maybe we don't know exactly the best patient population for it. And I have a few kind of, and I think a lot of people do have a few kind of like opinions or hypotheses about why that may be the case. One of those might be that some women just have a shorter window of implantation than others. And for those women, maybe these ERA tests are helpful. But how do you identify these women ahead of time? Maybe for other women where their window of implantation is like a full 48 hours or even longer, it's not helpful to do these ERA tests because it's long enough where, we're going to get it no matter where we go. And so I think what these studies are just pointing out to me is that we need to continue personalizing the care, right? Like we need to continue personalizing if we're doing these types of studies, who we're doing them for, to really think about why it is that we're doing it for that individual. So I've got to be honest, I don't use them a ton. I do use it in some isolated situations. I used to use it a lot more. That's just, my simple take on it.
Yeah, I remember when this study came out, I was a little shocked thinking like, who's doing it on everyone anyways? Like, I mean, that doesn't even make any sense. Why would you do it on everyone? If you have a 60 or 70% live birth rate, why are you doing this test? I mean, what are you trying to get like another 1% or something? Like, so why would you do it on everyone? And it's expensive. And that's actually part of what the study looked at, was saying like the cost, like, is it even beneficial? I think though, whenever I look at things, I always look at it from like, okay, but I was a patient once before. Like I've talked about this before, and I've talked about it in my podcast, that like for a doctor, 1% doesn't seem like a lot, right? But then like for a patient, we look at the cost effectiveness and say how expensive something is, but for a patient, 1% is huge. That's a huge thing in their mind. And so I think one of the things about the study is I think we can all agree everyone doesn't need to do it. And I was shocked when I found out people were doing it on everyone. I've never done that, and I've never even recommended that. I think it was definitely a bad idea. But I think the question that came up was, is there any harm, right? Because if let's say there's zero harm, then at that point, you really can't tell a patient not to do it because it doesn't harm them, right? And so that's the one thing that was a little bit concerning in this study, was they said that when there was a really big distance away, so when they were actually telling them like, go, instead of 100 and let's say 12 hours, 140 hours or something like that, like was a huge distance away, more than 24 hours, it trended. Now, again, not statistically significant, but trended as if it might be a lower pregnancy rate. And that's scary, right? Because then at that point, you're going, crap, I don't want someone that can have a worse cycle, right? And unfortunately, with a retrospective study, we can't truly know. And again, it wasn't statistically significant. The only part that was statistically significant, meaning was proven, was if empirically you give to everyone, you're not going to benefit everyone. And you're just wasting people's time and money. But the part that really gave pause was that question of, is it harming things? Now, on the same thing in that study, the bigger one that started it all, was it showed actually a trend towards improving things for people who had recurrent pregnancy losses, or recurrent implantation failure. And so then it's like, that's kind of what I've always used it for, is people have failed. And my general thought has always been like, if you put back 2 euploid embryos, whether it's one transfer or one twice, at that point, if you haven't got implantation, I'm always a big fan of going with at least looking that way. I don't like to do it before then. But the question that comes up, though, is this question of, what if you only have one shot, right? You're 44 years old. You've went through multiple cycles. You finally have this embryo. What do you have to lose? And so before, it was kind of like, well, nothing. You can't lose anything. Just might as well do it. And I still believe that's somewhat true. I do not think the evidence there is yet to show that it's harmful yet. But I do think it's something we have to not dismiss. I think it has to be figured out. I think there's something that we have to do, some type of prospective study, which there are going on right now, that just the results haven't come out yet. When we get it, we'll all adjust. But how do you tell someone that went through 4 or 5 IVF cycles to get that one embryo that, no, you shouldn't do an ERA? And then, here it is, they go, it doesn't work. And you find out, oh, wow, they were off. And the studies do show it would have benefit her, right? Sure, it might not empirically benefit them, but that's a situation where I have a hard time saying, no, that's a situation I recommend it where someone that hasn't had a transfer. Love to see what you think of that. I know that I am not in the norm of that. I am definitely kind of a little bit on my own on that standpoint. I know some doctors agree with that, me too, but I'd love to see what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a few things about being in that, patient group that makes it so tough. It's that, if you have just a one embryo and things are so limited and, you're always going to wonder, well, what if I would have done this one extra thing? What if I would have done this one extra thing? What if I would have done this extra thing? And, there is like some minimal data on a lot of stuff. But I think if we start just kind of adding on all these things, I worry that we're just adding on a lot of cost without adding on a lot of benefit. And I think that's always my biggest hesitation. So sometimes we do add in just, one test because we have a suspicion of something, or, maybe we have a suspicion that somebody may have endometriosis. So we really want to look to see if that's the case, to treat it accordingly. With the ERA, again, I have personally not found a big role for it in that I find that it is improving implantation rates beyond the baseline, except if there is a known problem in the background. And so you're right, in the past there was that study, there's been a few that have at least questioned, like, hey, is there maybe a trend towards it even hurting things potentially? And again, I just don't think there's enough data to say that that's the case. So I think there's minimal harm to doing it beyond the additional cost of doing it at this point. And I think the implantation window is probably generous for most people, to where
Right.
there's almost a little bit of a natural fudge factor. And I think, and I'll throw out one last thing kind of as a thought, and that's that we know embryos can actually implant outside of the uterus. They can implant in the fallopian tube. They can even implant on the ovary. They can implant in the peritoneum. So meaning in the belly outside of the uterus. So clearly there is more than we fully understand yet, because if there was such a narrow window and that window was super prohibitive, like you could just never ever implant at any time ever anywhere, then we wouldn't have ectopic pregnancies. Those would just have never happened. And so I think there's more than meets the eye here. I think we still haven't cracked this puzzle. I just don't know if ERA gives us enough solutions. And I think we just haven't found the perfect patient population to apply it to 100% of the time. But that's just my opinion. Again, I think there's just not great data to direct us at this point.
There's only so much data out there right now. The one thing I think I want to make sure people know who are listening to this, and I think the thing that we're discussing here is, I don't think anyone should ever think that an ERA makes your chances better. So I think this is a common misunderstanding. And that's why when studies come out and say, well, does it make better? I go, well, I would never expect it to be better. The question is that if the timing's off, is it worse? Meaning, if your best is 60% live birth rate, if the ERA is off, you're going to be less than 60%. If it's on, and let's say you adjust, you're still getting back to 60. You're not going to be at 90 now. It's not going to make your chances better, because again, at the end of the day, most people are landing at the right time, right? So it's never about making your chances better. The question is, what if you're one of those people who are off, and do you have the chance to find out if you can make a mistake? And I think that's the part where I still struggle, is that until someone can tell me for sure that there's an absolute harm, and there is no data yet to support there is harm. There is data, there's a trend, and only with the very wide windows when it's like further off, like like more than 24 hours, is there some question in that, but that it could be harmful. Again, what harm is it? And that's the part I just know, like I know, like I look at my wife and I go, like, it wasn't like we could have 3 transfers, it was 1 shot. Now again, I didn't do the ERA, things went fine. I always also wonder, like, and it's one of the questions I saw in there, someone asked about, like, does endometriosis or endometritis or things like that affect it? We don't know what affects the ERA. We really don't, right? So, I mean, could it affect it? I mean, technically it shouldn't, because DNA is just, causing messengers to be made or at certain times, but it is possible. I mean, there could be things that could affect it, right? I mean, we know that the environment can affect it. And so is it possible that people could be in the wrong zone because we're only looking at these profiles, and the profiles can be affected. And then the other part of that is, what about embryo quality? And what I mean by that is this: if an embryo is perfect, I mean, it's the messiah of embryos. I mean, it might be able to be off the timing a little bit more, right? And then other embryos that are, they're good, but the trophectoderm is not as good. It may struggle a little bit more. Does the timing matter more with those? And this is the stuff we just don't know. And so the question that I know a lot of patients have this, because I've had these questions before, is, do I wait until someone has evidence to say it works and I keep failing? Or do we say, listen, it's reasonable to try and put your best foot forward? And like you said, I think the most important thing to figure out right now is it harmful? And as of now, like I said, nothing is jumping out, but it'll be interesting to see what it shows. So anything you have to add? I think, well, let's get to some of these questions here. And I know this is a very popular, and somewhat controversial topic.
Yeah, no, let's just jump into these questions. I think we've let's just go ahead and do that.
So let's have let's say, Ari, you want to jump on and let us know where we should start? Or
Yes, great discussion going on. So we have lots of questions. People are really participating, which is awesome. We can go into the start column. You guys want to just start from the top and we can work our way down?
I didn't even know you could just hit the start column. I just learned that now. So yeah, let's work our way down. Okay. So one of the first questions I kind of brought into it was, would having endometriitis affect the results of an ERA? What do you think on that, Dr. Salem? Like I was saying, I don't think so, because why would it make the DNA, make the messenger RNA make more? But I do believe there could be things that could affect it. I'd love to see your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, the gene kind of signature that they're looking at doesn't seem to vary as a result of endometritis or endometriosis. And again, I think they have. Now I'm digging deep here to when they first kind of did these studies, but they did control for those early on, just to make sure, of course, that we're not getting noise from folks who have endometritis, endometriosis, and they kind of basically would take a group of patients that were all kind of quote unquote normal, but some had endometriosis or endometritis, and they didn't notice that there was any meaningful variation in this fingerprint. So I think we're safe in doing it, whether you have endometriosis or not. It's kind of equally, let's call it equally effective in either case.
Yeah. It's bringing up a question that I just thought about. I've seen this before from other doctors where, like, we do natural FETs, and sometimes what we'll do is we'll do an ERA with it. However, as you and I know, the more variables you have, the harder it is to reproduce things. And so one of the things we do is we give a trigger. We're like, we make sure the progesterone that day is not elevated. We give the trigger and we have the timing pretty accurate. Now, it's important to understand, when you take a trigger shot, it's not like everyone absolutely ovulates at 36 hours. Some could be 38, some could be 35, some could be, so a small wiggle room. But I've seen some people, doctors, where they'll literally just let someone ovulate naturally, and they go, yeah, just figure out when you ovulate and let us know, and then we'll base off of the OPK. And it kind of goes against the argument, like you're saying, right, is if you're making this test saying that 12 hours matters, but it's okay that someone thinks they ovulate this time, it's not that perfect. Like, is the test really working, or is it not? 12 hours too small? And that's why I said I do believe the 24-hour makes more sense if people are using that way. But yeah, I agree with you. I can't imagine in an infection causing a problem that. You want to read the next question? Let's see.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a question that reads, data has come out that 120 hours of progesterone should be the standard in an FET. What are your thoughts on that? So you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah. So I'm not aware of a specific study that came out saying that. I know there are what are called committee opinions out there that talk about what are average. But I'm not aware of that specific one. Maybe Dr. Salem is aware of that. There's data that's come out. And I know as patients, sometimes when you hear data comes out, studies, it could be a very small study. It may not be very good. But the way it's sounding, and I know this person actually pretty well, she wouldn't say that if it wasn't something significant. So it must have been a pretty significant study she's talking about that I'm just maybe not aware of at this moment that came out and said it should be the standard. But I know there are some recent ones that come out about I said, committee opinions and things like that. Are you aware of any current study at 120 hours?
So I'm not aware of one sort of unifying study that's saying, yep, obviously 120 hours for everybody. And I will say the other side of that coin is also that there are many great IVF clinics across the country that use slightly different windows, meaning some will always use 120 hours. Some will use slightly more than 120 hours. And so there's a window where we think it's kind of ideal. But certainly we know that there is not, as of yet, kind of one proven perfect way. And there's a lot of nuance here too. Like, for example, how quickly does the progesterone level rise for that individual? Are you using just vaginal progesterone, or do you start just with intramuscular progesterone, or is it a natural cycle? So I think we have still so much variation between the different protocols that what's really happening for the most part is there's a range. And I think every good clinic studies their own data very, very well to understand, how they line up their patients so that the embryo transfers are happening during their absolute ideal window based on their own results. And that's why we're seeing different clinics that have slightly different periods of time that the progesterone is turned on. It's not just an on-off switch entirely, because obviously the progesterone comes on, in kind of like layers. There's a dose-dependent effect. So yeah, it's a great question. And I think basically no studies has put like an end to this debate.
Yeah, if you're available to come on live and talk to us and tell us where you got that from, that'd be great. We'd love to have that discussion. It's interesting talking about that. I mean, obviously the window's not that tight either, right? So there never could come out with a number saying it has to be 120 hours, because that doesn't even make sense. Like, you would assume that the window is this really tiny window. We know it's wider than that. So it would be a range, it'd be like 110 to 120 hours are the highest likelihood in this study or something like that. There was that, I don't know if you remember, they did that, SRM posted that, they took the top clinics and they said these are the characteristics of the top clinics. And even in that, it was a wide range of what people did. When I was at my previous clinic, when I used to work with Dr. Ketan Patel, very smart guy, good clinic. We had very good rates there. He actually did less hours than we did, or that we do here. And they had good rates. And I mean, it was very little. They would start the progesterone in the morning, and on the 5th day, we're doing the transfer. So it was maybe 4 days of progesterone, and
112 hours.
Rates. It was actually even less. It was almost 100. It was even a little less than that. And so what was interesting is what made us switch is we started noticing when we were doing the genomics with the company, they had the 12-hour thing. A lot of our patients were off by 12 hours. Now, the ones, like I told you, that really benefited the most were the ones that were over 24 hours. But the thing is, we noticed so many people were off by 12 hours. And we know this in the past, whenever we used to fail and we do a natural FET, that added on about 12 extra hours. And I said to myself, I wonder if we really should move it up. And I knew other places did it a little bit later. So I said, you know what? Based off the data, based off other places, I'm going to change our numbers. And I did. So we added, we had it now start the night before, and our pregnancy rates went up. And so it shows you that, again, I don't know if the demographics were different, but I do believe you can never have just one number, because, there's so many different types of patients you're seeing. If you're doing more natural cycles, it affects it a little bit more. how, if you're doing injectable progesterone, it starts immediately. If you're doing, vaginal, it might take a little longer. There's just so much. But I hope if she doesn't come on live, I'm probably going to reach out there and ask her because I'd love to know where that came from. So I'll go to the next one, which is I'll read that one from Amanda. Thank you. It says, do you need to do an ERA before every transfer? So I think the question that she's asking here is not, do you need to do an ERA? We've already answered that no, you don't have to always do it. But I think she's saying, like, you have a transfer successful. Do you need to do it again? Do you have to recheck it? And so I'm going to give you the generic answer that I've been told by the companies. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's right. But what the companies say is, if it's a vaginal delivery, you probably don't need to repeat it as long as there is no major complication. A C-section, they recommend it. And then they also say within 2 or 3 years. Again, that's just based off of them saying it. Whether it needs it or not, love to hear your opinion on this. What do you think, Dr. Salem?
Yeah, again, I think that, it's one of these things where if we believe that it has if there's some genetic propensity, like for some reason, this individual always, their lining is always 24 hours, out of their frame shift, and that's a genetic thing that's built into their kind of genetic profile that we keep seeing, and how the RNA is being profiled. Then, I can't think of many reasons why that should be changing as a result of a delivery. Now, I'm very happy to be, proven wrong. That's a complete hypothesis. I'm not saying I have data behind that. And so, I just think that we're so far, upstream from really knowing whether we should repeat it. Do you repeat it every year? Do you repeat it, every second year? Do you repeat it with a C-section? Again, without the proper data to guide us here, I think it's kind of a little hand wavy, and just to be totally honest. And by the way, medicine for a really long period of time just went off of that. We still use a lot of expert opinion and
Yep.
Guidelines that are not based on perfect randomized controlled trials. So that's not a wrong thing to practice in gray zones like that. But I'm just saying I don't know. And as a result of that, I probably wouldn't repeat it myself.
Yeah, I think, I never look at everything as just black and white. I would look at it more as a situation, right? So the situation is this. If you have 6 more embryos and you got pregnant in your back, don't do it again. Why? I don't even care if you had a C-section. I don't even care if they recommend it. Like, just do another transfer with the timing. It's probably going to work. And that's what I would tell someone. Now, if you're on your last embryo and you made them when you were 36 and maybe now you're 42 now and you're like, I don't even know if this is going to work again. Is it unreasonable? I mean, it's money, right? And so right now what we're saying is we don't know if a study later may say there was some harm. The only thing is there's a slight question of when there's a big difference between the testing, meaning more than the 24 hours, there might be a decrease in pregnancy rate. But right now we just don't know. And so that's how I look at it. I still, like I said, it's an area that we don't know well enough. And it's the only thing we have. And sometimes when it's the only thing you have, you go, do you do nothing? And we've all seen those cases where recurrent failure, and then you do this and it works. And like I said, so it's interesting, but I do agree 100%. If you are someone who doesn't have a problem with implantation and you did the ERA the first time and you probably didn't need to do it, then yeah, I definitely wouldn't repeat it. But if you're someone who had recurrent implant failure, you did it and then it finally worked, you finally got pregnant, I think that comes down to that situation, how many embryos you have, and you got to look at your situation specific, right? Customized to that situation.
Yeah, exactly. Is it recommended that the ERE? Oh, sorry.
No, you go. Yeah.
No, I was just taking this next one here. Is it recommended that the ERE be repeated prior to each transfer, or is the result of one ERA expected to be the same for each cycle? So again, a little bit related to the previous question, and excellent question, but I think I kind of give my 2 cents on that one. But do you have another take on it with this spin?
No, I mean, I think it's still the same thing, I don't think it ever has to be done prior to each transfer, but I don't think we know enough either. Like you said, plausibility wise, it's like, could it affect it? It shouldn't, because you think if the whole goal is when the uterus is ready to implant, it should be the same. But I mean, that's the thing with the human body. I literally did a whole podcast on this last night. Like, it's not the experiment you can do, because nothing stays the same. Everything changes. I mean, even your diet could change, right? There's so much that can change it. So I can't say no that it's not unreasonable. I think right now the hard part is I don't believe it's harmful at this point, right? To the point of saying people shouldn't do it. Like, it's not like someone taking heparin. That could be harmful. I mean, you get a small subchoric hemorrhage, you just potentially lost a pregnancy. Now that something would have been minor. I don't at this time believe it's severely harmful. I've looked at the data. The study's okay. It's not great. So I personally feel like if it's someone wants to do it, it's reasonable. But I agree with you 100%. Do I think they need to? No, I don't. But I don't think it's unreasonable. And again, I look at each situation separately. So,
yeah.
I'm going to jump to the next question, because there's a little bit more about ERA. And we're going to focus on those today. Is an ERA test necessary after a miscarriage or embryo transfer at 7 weeks, or is it mostly for failed transfer? Thanks so much. So, I feel like I'm talking forever, so I'm gonna let you talk on this one. I think it's gonna be the same. You and I are gonna say the same on this one, which is it's really for failed transfers. But I'd love to hear your view.
That's right. That's right. I think the way we use this test is to answer the question of why is the embryo not implanting? Or said another way, when should I put the embryo in the uterus for things to line up perfectly? So it really doesn't give us any information, in my opinion, on the risk of miscarriage. There's a lot of other things that we can do for miscarriage, but we got to use the right tool for the right question. And I think here, ERA is not the right tool for this specific question.
Yeah. The next question is something we answered, but I think it's a great one. It says, what percentage does it add to success if you're not receptive and this is adjusted? And so this goes back to that point. It doesn't ever improve your chances of a transfer. It can never make it better. It's only the question is, if it's true that it's off, it may go lower. There is no number that no one can ever not be receptive. I mean, other than like a scarred uterus or something where it's so bad a baby can't implant in there or something like that, like an isthmuscilla that fills the whole uterus with fluid. You're not going to get pregnant with that. But I think you would agree with me, Dr. Salem, there's no point where you're not receptive. Yes, it might move a little bit, but it never goes down to zero. Like, no one doesn't get pregnant because of it, because I've seen it. I mean, I've seen people put in like cellular embryos on day 5 and someone still gets pregnant. Like, how did that happen? That's 2 days later than when they should have. And I've seen it the other way around. So we know it can still implant. The question just is, how much does it affect it? What was the quality of that embryo and stuff? What do you think?
I totally agree. I mean, I think there's not a whole, there's really nothing I would add to that. I totally agree.
So one of my friends is on here. Interesting. I'm going to say his name out because I know he won't care, because he's not like a fertility patient. His name's Steve Rooks. This guy's a brilliant guy, by the way, and just loves data. And so his question is, what is your thoughts about endometrial scratching in combo with ERA? And so I think the first thing, let's define what this means. In the past, there used to be this thought that when you took a biopsy of the uterus, we call that an endometrial scratch. We know it creates some inflammation in the uterus, and it's kind of the GSF type of washes that people used to do, that it creates this inflammation that they thought improved implantation. Now, how much it affects every person, I don't know, but that was the thought behind it, and that's what's called an endometrial scratch. It's not actually going there and scratching anything, it's just a biopsy. So when you do an ERA or you do a receptive or anything like that, it is basically doing the scratch. And what happened was, when it first came out, and I only remember this, when the ERA came out, everyone said, well, is it just helping because you're just doing the scratch? Now, for everyone to understand this, you understand that the scratch is a very controversial thing. This has been I think since I even started thinking about going into fertility, people were doing scratches, and then people weren't doing scratches, and they come out and said it's good and said it's bad. And there is now clear evidence that the scratch does not benefit in any way. That part has been pretty much proven. I don't believe, unless you know some doctors saying to me that it will cause harm. I did not ever see anything that says it causes harm, but it is definitely proven not the benefit. So the question then comes up is, what's my thought then about the scratch or the combo of the ERA? I mean, I think it has no benefit. And I think that, if the ERA does have benefits purely from the ERA, it's not from the scratch. But like I said, I don't know, would you have the answer to that?
Yeah, no, I think that the endometrial scratch was one of these things where it was like, when you first hear about it, you're like, could this really be the case that, that we were all along, we were going in with a diagnostic test and we got this like unintended benefit from it? How cool, how, how serendipitous or something. But yeah, it turned out that was too good to be true. And I think that, multiple studies have been done, randomized controlled trials. There was one that they very, cleverly called, like somehow they like stitched all the words together and they called it the scratch trial. Anyway, at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like it helped, and did it cause any harm? No, I don't think so. I mean, it's always, I don't think it caused harm in the sense like did it lower pregnancy rates? No, but it cost people an extra cycle. It cost people, an endometrial biopsy, whatever the, monetary cost of that might be. And the pain, anybody who's ever done an endometrial biopsy or who has had one done understands that we don't take those lightly. We better have a really good reason to do those. So, I think that the big picture here is that, just like so many things, original data was rosy and optimistic, and then the real data came out later, and that's medicine, and we just come around to it and we say, well, the current medicine is that this is not helpful.
There's a couple other questions. They're not specifically on the ERA, and so I'm not going to talk about them tonight, because I think it would be good as just kind of good to summarize for people to see what our opinions are. And I think it's really important to everyone's sense. This is 100% opinions. There is no absolute data out there. The data that's there that we have is what's called a retrospective study, which means it's the best we have. And when you have the best, it's kind of like when COVID came out, right? When there was a lot of things that were wrong, but no one was wrong. It's just that's the best data we had at that time. And then we later found out, oh, we were wrong. And so it's still possible this data could be wrong. It could also be very right. So I can tell you in my feeling, if I had to tell the people who I would recommend an ERA to, and I'm sure my list is going to be a lot bigger than yours. So I was thinking maybe you go first and tell who you think are, because I'm probably going to cover the ones you say, and then I'll tell the ones that I think are very reasonable to do too.
Hey, I think that's a fun way to do it. So yeah, again, ERA is one of these things that I think, the dust hasn't settled on it yet. I'm not willing to, close that chapter. I'm not willing to close that opportunity. And the reason I'm not, in summary, is because we really don't have many other tools to test for, this fertile window, the endometrial receptivity for implantation. And so I still think it has a role. So where do I use it? I use it primarily if somebody has had recurrent implantation failure. And we talk about the pros and cons of the test. So we say, well, our standard protocol is to give this much progesterone, but we may adjust that depending on what the ERA tells us. And if we've transferred 2 genetically normal embryos that are of fair or good quality, most of the time, I mean, the vast majority of the time, we have a positive HCG and 9 months later, a baby. So if that's not happening, especially the first part, the positive HCG part, that's when I talk about using the ERA. I talk about it exactly like we were talking about it today. It's a shared decision-making process. I say, listen, this is the best test that we have. I'm not saying you have to have it, but this is why I think maybe we want to explore this. Outside of that, I kind of reserve using that test. The other indication where I will use the test, or I will use data from that test, is if somebody previously had an ERA, they did IVF, they used the evidence from their ERA, and they were pregnant. And in those cases, I would say, well, it's kind of silly that I'm just going to throw out all of your own personal data just because there's some study out there that says the ERA is no good. No, let's go back and let's see what your data said. And if that ERA was from a year or two ago, then we'll use that data. And if we need to repeat it because it's been 5 years, then let's repeat it. It seems to be beneficial for you. So that's kind of, those are the two big scenarios that I think I use it in. But and I bet I'll agree with some of the ones that you do, and I'm just not mentioning them. So why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not the most liberal out there. I know there's people who do it for everything, and like I said, I'm not that. But I also know there's even doctors in my own town who will not do it. Someone can have failed transfer, they will not even do it, which I don't understand, but that's their choice. You brought up something that was really kind of interesting. I don't know if you meant it when you said it, but we kind of already do an ERA when you were talking about when someone's coming back for a retrieval, like whether, let's say they were at another clinic, right? And they come to your clinic and maybe you do 120 hours, but the clinic they were at was 135 or 136. Well, you're not going to change and say, hey, do it our way now. You're going to say, hey, it worked in the past. Let's do it. Let's do it the way they did last time. And we try to mimic that. So it's kind of an ERA in the way that we have historical data. And I tell people, if you're filling at your clinic, well, then yeah, I want to do it what we're doing. And so we try to mimic the other clinic where it worked. And if it's not, then we try other things different. So everything you said, I agree 100% with. Those are the people I'd recommend. I think the people it's best for are going to be people who have failed implantation. I mean, like, we're talking no HCG. I feel if you get no implantation at all, I know there's different definitions of implantation. Some people will say a 5 is not implanting, and we've talked about that. No, something implanted at that point. But if you've had 0 implantation, I think it's at least worth looking, and it happened twice. With PGT embryos. I pretty much recommend 100% if someone's had 2 PGT embryos, no implantation. There's interesting. I've talked about this. When someone fails a transfer in my clinic, I like to do day 5, 7, 9 ECGs. And over time, I've actually did this for about 6 months. We looked at the data, and there's this group of patients has this very low level HCG levels, and then they go right back down. Like, it's almost like it's struggling to implant. I find that, and we've looked at this, like most of these patients end up having something wrong in their timing. Now, again, I can't, it's not causality. I don't know what's causing, but for some reason they have this. The other area that I really highly recommend is people who can't get a thick lining. Now, I'm not talking about someone with like a scarred uterus. I'm saying someone who the estrogen levels are good and they just never get a thick lining. They never get above a 5, like 5.5, 5. I have had a very hard time with those patients getting them pregnant, and most people do. There's tons of data out there that show that there are lower pregnancy rates. But what's interesting is almost every time when I do these ERAs on these patients who, when I make changes and they don't get thicker and then that's it, that's the best they get, they come back off. And I honestly don't get nervous about these patients anymore. I tell them, as long as it looks good and you have an ERA, I feel much more comfortable doing the transfer. And I've had pretty good success. So that's the other big group I do it on. After that, the ones that I think are reasonable are, like I said, is when someone only has 1 embryo and, and their journey to get to that embryo is very difficult. Like I said, whether they've gone through multiple cycles to get there or things that I don't think it's unreasonable to do that stuff. And as of now again, will it change? Yeah. Some data come out and they say, no, it definitely hurts people. Sometimes I'm going to go, okay, then we have to be careful about this. We never want to do any harm. But as of right now, the part about a study like this, the one that was done and the other ones have been done, is that you got different doctors doing transfers. You have, different embryologists doing things. You have, there's so many parts of this. I mean, was the same embryologist doing the biopsies? Maybe one wasn't as good as the other, hurting more than there's just so much stuff. And unless you're doing it truly prospectively and randomized, you're not getting that full randomization. And so when you take a place like this and they do a retrospective, there's so much confounders that can fall into it. And I just don't feel like we can just tell people not to do it now because of that study. But I do think we can say it's definitely not worth doing for everyone. And I've always had that stance from the very beginning. So I think that part you and I have always agreed on. So, and we agree on really all of them. I mean, like I said, the things I'm saying are just the extreme examples here. So,
yeah, and I agree with quite a few of the ones that you said there. But yes, I think it's one of these tests, and I hope that this test continues to improve. And I want to leave this this live session with maybe just like a little bit of optimism, which is that I think that there may be space here as they continue to collect more data, especially with the introduction of more sophisticated machine learning AI, that they might be able to better identify the group of people who really, really, really benefits from it. And that's what I hope happens in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a really good point about how do you write off something on version 1, right? If anyone used ChatGPT when it first came out, it was amazing, but then you realize, wow, ChatGPT is really stupid here. Like, it's making lots of mistakes. Now, ChatGPT is a genius, and it's like, in the next version will be better. So how can we rule it off completely when it's constantly getting better? It's refining, right? The data. I mean, eventually when they start using the AI with it, it might be able to even make it more refined, where they're like, now it can get rid of some of the noise. So yeah, that's the hard part with studies. And that's why I think sometimes a lot of patients do appreciate clinics that are willing to sometimes try things that are at least not obviously harmful, because we all realize that, yeah, it's really obvious to know when something's working, that we can all agree. But when things start, right, it does take time until there's proof. And so do some patients have to wait until it's proven, or are some places willing to try it and be somewhat, as a leader in that? And so that's why I've always been, interested in all these new things. And there's metabolomics coming up that I'm excited about. And I think there's going to be a day, like you and I have talked about this the other day, where when it comes to transfers, there's going to be the embryo. We're like, the embryo's good. And we're going to 1 month look at things and go, don't do the transfer this month. Your hormones aren't looking right. Uterus is cramping a little bit. This isn't the month. Let's wait the next month. And right now, all we do is we look at ultrasounds. We use our expert opinion. We use this ERA that may be helpful, but it's the one area that we literally suck at, which is, how do we know that the home that we're putting this embryo in is good? We just don't really know. And we do the best we can using historical data, but it is the one area that we are the weakest in fertility, is the uterine environment. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate, again, tonight. I know you and I both take away from our families, and we really appreciate people come and listen to this, because we really do. I mean, we're at home, our families are waiting for us. And so we do this because we love talking about these things, and we really appreciate the questions. This was one of my favorite sessions so far. So anything you have to add, Dr. Salem?
No, that was a great session. Really, really enjoyed it, and love talking about controversial issues, especially in our field. So, because I think these kinds of longer conversations can really help our patients understand, the nuance of all this. And sometimes I wish we had an hour to talk about just the ERA with every single patient, but the reality is we don't. So I'm glad that we get to do this to kind of give them our opinion. And thanks so much for everybody who joined today.
Yeah, and if you guys have questions, again, please ask your doctor, or send us a message, and more than happy to answer it outside of here. So thanks so much. Ari, again, let me bring you on, because again, I think people don't realize how much you do, because you're the one putting all the questions up and getting them teed up for us. So thank you so much, Ari, for helping us. And look forward to seeing you guys again, hopefully in about 2 weeks here. We'll do another topic.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.